organized by the Nunavik Institute for European Studies at the University of Notre Dame in the US and Warsaw University in Poland. For those of you who have joined us here for the first time, my name is Magda Harzyńska-Wójcik. I represent the former institution, and usually next to me is Professor Monika Opalińska from the University of Warsaw. We are jointly responsible for the series. As a last moment development, Professor Opalińska can't join us today, for which she asked me to extend her apology. And to all of you, let me very briefly walk you through the series. So far, the first lecture in our series was delivered by Professor Michael Kuczynski, who spoke to us from the US about Richard Rowley's translation of the Psalms, their edition and their editor. Then we moved to Europe with Dr. Samira Lindstedt's talk about the Psalmic prayers. Our third lecture moved us back to the US and also back in time to antiquity with Professor Hildegund Miller, who told us about Augustine's Narrationes in Psalmos. And today we are back to Europe and back to the Middle Ages with Youri Desplenter from the University of Ghent. Youri Desplenter is Professor of Historical Medieval Dutch Literature. He is very active both in research and in teaching. The range of areas he specializes in is truly amazing and encompasses a wide array of medieval topics such as Middle Dutch literature, codicology, theory, and methodology of the history of literature. Let me add that next to Middle Dutch, there is also Old Dutch. This range of topics, although exhaustive in itself, is further expanded by Professor Desplenter's dedication to the methodology of teaching Dutch. And this dedication is both theoretical and practical, which entails active involvement in students' internships in secondary schools. This is time-consuming, but also extremely important and very useful, both as the thing itself and as an opportunity to bridge the gap between secondary schools and academia, especially when it comes to disseminating the knowledge of historical literature, which is Youri's major concern. So each year, Youri gives a couple of dozens of workshops for students of secondary schools, and he teaches there about medieval manuscripts with special focus on Middle Dutch productions. How clever of you. Zooming in on Professor Desplenter's medieval research interests shows that they include Middle Dutch religious literature, especially late medieval prayer literature, Bible translations, and the more general contacts between Latin and the vernacular. And he has been true to this field ever since his PhD, which he obtained at the University of Ghent. It was a pioneering and comprehensive study, which is, you must admit, a very rare combination. So a study of Middle Dutch translations of the Latin hymns and sequences. His later research was devoted to the Middle Dutch Psalter translations and the writings of a 14th century mystic, Jan van Leven, apparently also a cook, as Youri has just told us. He was a lay brother who lived and worked at the convent of Grunendal. The scope of Youri's work on the topic is best illustrated by the fact that when you type in Jan van Leven in the internet, you are invariably directed to Youri's work on him. Professor Desplenter has published several articles and books on all of the aforementioned research topics, and all this work earned him the position of professor at Ghent University in 2010. Within his faculty, Professor Desplenter is currently chairman of the master's program in historical linguistics and literature and vice chairman of the Department of Literary Studies. He has ample experience in supervising doctoral research in all fields of his academic interest, that is Middle Dutch literature and teaching methodology, as well as eschatological writings in Middle Dutch. Today, Professor Youri Desplenter is going to talk about the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalms, its context, contexts of origin, functions, and Nachleben. Youri, the floor is yours. And so is the screen.
Thank you very much, Magda, for your kind introduction, and especially for the occasion to talk today to you about the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalms. So in the context of an, at this stage, still informal network on late medieval prayer in Europe, I am running together with, amongst others, Anna Dlabachova of Leiden University and Karolin Klukowski of the University of Oxford. I got to know Magda, and some time ago, she indeed asked me if I wanted to present a talk on Dutch Psalms or Dutch Psalm translations. As she mentioned, almost 20 years ago now, I had a postdoctoral project on the Middle Dutch Psalm translations. At that time, still only superficially studied. I was not very afraid to say yes to this opportunity. Now, some 10 years ago, I published my new insights concerning all the Middle Dutch Psalm translations, writings that came into being between 1275. It's on the slide, it still says 1250, but I changed my mind today. And the beginning of the 16th century. That was an article that has more than 50 pages. So for today's talk, I really had to limit myself. And I chose to discuss the oldest Middle Dutch translations of the Psalms for several reasons. First of all, recently, I published a couple of articles on the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Hours of the Virgin, a textual complex that mainly consists out of psalm translations, as you certainly know, in this case, in the version of the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalter. Some findings concerning these hours made me have a look at the other biblical texts that were translated into Middle Dutch in the 13th century as well, such as the Gospels and the Apocalypse, and I noticed that quite some research concerning the oldest Middle Dutch Bible translations still needs to be done, or even worse, needs to be done over. I talked about this on an international conference in Vienna in October last year, a conference which had the work of the 14th century Austrian Bible translator as a central topic. It convinced me even more to further analyze the oldest biblical material in Middle Dutch and to write a proposal for a research project. Today's talk is, in other words, a next step in my writing process of that proposal. It is therefore also work in progress, I should warn you. The third reason to choose for the oldest Psalter translation is that it has been of great influence and hence importance. In the following centuries, new translations of the Psalter were made in Dutch, but almost never did they start from a blank canvas. In most cases, the oldest translation is still present, sometimes in a very obvious way, but mostly not. The last reason to limit myself to the oldest Psalter translations is that while I was preparing for the Vienna conference, I received images of two folios, unknown until then, immediately identifiable as fragments of a Latin Psalter, curiously enough provided with a full interlinear Middle Dutch translation of the Psalms and verses in question. The one who sent them to me wondered if the folios were interesting enough to write an article about them, and if so, if I wanted to do that. As I had never seen such an interlinear Middle Dutch translation of the Psalter up until then, I thought they definitely were. So I will discuss them further in my talk more extensively, although this is also still very much work in progress. I can, however, already give away that the interlinear text also belongs to the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalter. That vernacular version is, however, not the oldest Psalter translation in Dutch. In several regions in early medieval, yes, here you see the translation more in focus. In several regions in early medieval Western Europe, I am afraid I do not know the Eastern situation, Latin Psalters were provided with interlinear versions in the vernacular, not only in Old Irish, Old English, Old High German, Old Saxon, or Old Frisian, but also in Old Dutch, or as it is technically known, Old Low Franconian. This term designates a group of dialects spoken in the regions that are more or less equal to nowadays Belgium and the Netherlands, but it also includes regions that are now part of Germany and France. In the period, that group of dialects was spoken in the period up until the beginning of the 12th century. There was at least one Latin psalter that had an interlinear version in an Old Dutch dialect, although it was clearly modeled after a German specimen. It is known as the Wachtendonckse Psalmen in Dutch, or in English, Wachtendonck Psalter. This interlinear version was made around the year 900 and has come down to us only in bits and pieces. The original manuscript has been lost. We only have transcriptions of the interlinear Old Dutch translations of about 1/3 of the Psalms, and these were made in the 16th and 17th centuries when the medieval manuscript was still available. We do, in other words, not know how the Psalter and the interlinear translation look like, but presumably it had the same form as comparable German interlinear Psalter translations from the same era, such as the Old Alemannic Psalter fragments. From the 12th century, we just have a reference of the famous priest Lambert Le Bègue, who died at the end of the 12th century, who translated certain biblical texts into French to an integral translation of the Psalter. This priest refers to an integral translation of the Psalter by a Flemish magister, as he calls him, so most probably a Dutch-speaking person. But nothing has come down to us from that text. This is, of course, in line with the written culture of the 12th century in the Low Countries. Extremely few writings in the Dutch vernacular have been preserved from that era. This starts to change from the year 1200 onwards, but the 13th century writings already show us a stage of Dutch that has quite evolved in the meantime. We call it, therefore, Middle Dutch. All in all, for the tradition of the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation, we had but 5 real textual witnesses up until recently. Except for one manuscript that was made in 1480, they all date from the first half of the 14th century. As far as I have had the opportunity to study the newly found 2 folios, I think the interlinear translation there was added in the second half or even in the last quarter of the 14th century. Already in this respect, the 2 new folios are an interesting find, as I will try to make clear later. The oldest textual witness of this Psalter translation is now kept in St. Petersburg. I hope it still is. It's the same manuscript that holds the oldest version of the Hours of the Virgin I already mentioned, but also other writings of extreme importance for the tradition of the Middle Dutch Bible translations, such as a Middle Dutch Epistolarium and the oldest Middle Dutch version of the Apocalypse. The manuscript was made in the second quarter of the 14th century. The Psalter translation in this manuscript is written in a Flemish dialect, but the Hours of the Virgin in the same manuscript are written in the dialect of Brabant, the first region, so a Flemish dialect, and then the Hours of the Virgin in the same manuscript are written in the dialect of Brabant, the first region to the east of the county of Flanders. As these hours contain quite a lot of translated psalms, the same as the ones in the Psalter in the first section of the manuscript, it is quite easy to compare them and notice that these have indeed been rewritten in another dialect. My present hypothesis is therefore that translations of biblical texts, first and foremost of the Psalms, were made in the West and later on were distributed to the East. Middle Dutch Psalters in the Brabant dialect have indeed come down to us also from the first half of the 14th century, but with the case of the St. Petersburg manuscript, I think I have clearly shown that the Brabant specimens are secondary. In my publications, I have therefore changed the former designation of this translation, which was the Flemish Brabant standard version of the Psalms and Canticles, into the West Flemish or Flemish translation of the Psalter. In former articles on this oldest Psalter translation, I have, amongst others, tried to contextualize the manuscriptal versions, as especially for these kinds of flexible texts, as we will see, this is the only way to fully grasp textual traditions. For the oldest tradition, I initially skipped the oldest stages because manuscripts from the 13th century are largely lacking. And I went to the works of someone who in older research was called the Bible translator of 1360. As indeed, we know that an anonymous religious person translated quite some books of the Bible, more specifically around the year 1360. Since the beginning of the 21st century, we know that this person must have been an inhabitant of the Carthusian convent of Herne. Herne is where the arrow points, so it's a bit below Brussels. So I will therefore refer to him as the Herne Bible translator. He was the first in the Low Countries to try and translate all the books of the Bible into Dutch, most probably at the request of patricians in the city of Brussels. As the Carthusian order conforms to a life of almost absolute silence and solitude, in the Middle Ages, their only way to spread God's word was by writing it. Especially the convent in Herne was extremely productive in this respect. Still, several dozens of manuscripts written there are extant, most of them containing the works of the Bible translator. It would indeed be very strange if this Carthusian monk would not have made a new translation of the Psalms, as it was a central text in Latin liturgy, of course, and moreover, the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalms certainly has its flaws. We, however, only have one manuscript with a text that shows some characteristics of the translation technique of the Herne Bible translator, and some scholars state that the version in the manuscript is indeed the Psalter translation made by the Bible translator, but I choose to be more careful. So I think it might also be an older text that was, or a later text that was influenced by the Herne Bible translator. In any case, it seems clear that the oldest Middle Dutch translation was known in Herne, as the text in this one manuscript was definitely based on the oldest Middle Dutch translation, as we find it in the 4 oldest witnesses. Herne was therefore my starting point to try and localize the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation. For their translations of most of the Bible books, the Carthusians of Herne indeed first of all collected as much older translations as they could. We can deduce that by the extant manuscripts of Herne. In other words, in Herne lays one of the keys to get hold of the older Bible translations, especially while most, as I already mentioned, most of the 13th and early 14th century Middle Dutch manuscripts are lost. In Herne, they, for instance, also had the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Apocalypse, also a Flemish text in origin, at their disposal, and we know that via Herne it got distributed in other religious communities in Brabant. We could therefore assume that the same happened to the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation. The fact that we have a couple of manuscripts written in Brabant in the first half of the 14th century could be because the Carthusians of Herne distributed the Flemish version even before their own Bible translator was active. The Charter House in Herne was founded in 1314, and it was the first one of that order in the Dutch-speaking region. They could indeed have started collecting and distributing older Bible translations before they got the idea to make newer and better translations themselves by the second half of the 14th century. Now, if you take a look at the primary relations between Herne and more Western regions, then the first obvious ones are other communities of the Carthusians. 4 years after the foundation of the community in Herne, a convent in Bruges of the same order came into being. We could assume that that one had the same goals and methods to spread God's word to the lay people by distributing religious texts in the vernacular, whether they collected them or whether they made them themselves. We know that there were frequent contacts between the two charter houses, with, for instance, priors moving from one house to another. More or less between Bruges and Herne, we find the city of Ghent, in which another charter house was founded in the year 1328. The youngest witness of the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation, the one written in 1480, was indeed made in Ghent. For this witness, a much older manuscript at the time must have been used, as the language in it is quite archaic, with words that were not used anymore after circa 1400. This could confirm the hypothesis that this oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalter, first of all, traveled in and was distributed from the 3 aforementioned charter houses. It would, for instance, explain why in the St. Petersburg manuscript that was written in Brabant, the Psalter translation is written in a Flemish dialect and is positioned just before the same psalms which are written in a Brabant dialect in the Hours of the Virgin. Or it could also explain why the Flemish version of the Psalter is as good as equal as the one in another Brabant manuscript from the same era. Much of what we know about the Middle Dutch Psalter translations before my own research was thanks to this Leiden professor in theology, Cornelis de Bruyn. He worked, however, in an era in which medieval texts were still seen as largely static, with the author or the translator as the most important quantity. In his research, more specifically, the Latin Bible text was the most important quantity. He and his collaborators made, for example, a whole series of editions of the Middle Dutch Bible translations, in which they did not strictly follow the text in the manuscripts, but adapted the text to the Vulgate. By doing so, they ignored the manuscript reality and made it very difficult for future researchers who since a couple of decades work with completely other paradigms. They made it impossible to use the aforementioned editions. Now it is, for instance, clear that medieval texts, certainly non-canonical texts, were constantly adapted even from one copy to the next. That is also why it is sometimes quite difficult to distinguish between certain traditions of, for instance, Psalter translations, as these were indeed constantly adapted and revised, and adapted versions constantly influenced each other. Nevertheless, it is safe to say that the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Psalter originally and generally had the intention to serve next to the Latin text, in this case of the Gallican Psalter. They were largely, as I would call them, subtitle translations. Only from the 15th century onwards, Psalter translations were made to be read without the Latin text, whether that text is in the manuscript or read aloud. Mainly in the context of the Devotio Moderna, the Reform movement that came into being in the northern part of the Low Countries at the end of the 14th century. So first of all, within the modern devotion, they made Psalter translations that were designed to function not in the context of Latin liturgy. Under influence of that movement, more and more communities of semi-religious people, especially women, were founded, in which the officium divinum in Latin was no obligation. These people normally limited their collective prayer to texts in the vernacular. The most popular Middle Dutch version of the Psalter, a far nephew of the oldest Middle Dutch translation that is central here. So the most popular Middle Dutch version of the Psalter could be called a prayer translation. So I distinguish between subtitle translations and prayer translations. Its function, so the function of a prayer translation, was not to stay as close to the Latin as the oldest version, but to supply a collection of prayers that could be read and understood fluently. At the end of the 13th century and in the beginning of the 14th century in the southern part of the Low Countries, however, the number of semi-religious communities was relatively modest, and most of the inhabitants were Beguines. It is not entirely impossible that the oldest Middle Dutch translation was intended for these women, as some have claimed, but that cannot be deduced from the extant manuscripts. What can be deduced from most of the textual witnesses that hold the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation is that the interaction between the Latin and the vernacular could happen in very different ways. A more detailed discussion of those manuscripts will show us that. First of all, before discussing all the individual manuscripts, I would like to make clear how the translation under scrutiny looked like in the St. Petersburg Psalter, as that holds most probably a version that is close to the original text and intention. I will combine it with the manuscript made in 1480, as that witness contains, as I already mentioned, a text that certainly dates from the 14th century. Probably the first half, as the wording is quite archaic. To prevent alterations and influences from other translations, I quote from Psalm 77, so that's the Vulgate number, as I noticed that psalters were often adapted in the first 10 or so psalms, but less in the further ones. Moreover, Psalm 77 is not part of a shorter series of psalms such as these penitential psalms, because I noticed that, at least in the Middle Dutch traditions, these were translated more and in a different way than complete psalters. So, first of all, we have a look at the oldest textual witness. And here you see a translation of verse 40 and 43 in Latin, and then in the translation in the St. Petersburg Psalter, and where it says between square brackets Tor, that's a manuscript in Toronto, written in 1480, but with a much older text in it. So when we have a look at the translation, then we see that it stays relatively close to the Latin. So quotiens is who, exacerbaverunt is vertorenden, eum vertorenden sie. Eum is this ne, in is in, deserto is der woestinen. So it's more or less a word for word translation. And indeed, if you take a look at the text in the St. Petersburg manuscript, then you see that the Toronto manuscript has even a more original wording. In Latin, it says in equoso, and in Toronto, it says, indeed, literally translated onwaterigen. So as is subscribed here in English, in the place without water. And I also think that the text in Toronto in many cases is the original one, because, for instance, in Campo Tanios is translated Campo Tanios. So a translation that stays very close to the Latin. And we know that translations that are closer to the Latin tend to be more original. In the wording in the St. Petersburg manuscript, we already read the translation of Campo in Dutch, veld, field in English. The same we can deduce from verses 49 and 51, but so for instance, in St. Petersburg, per is translated by over. In Toronto, it's closer to the Latin, translated by be. And also primitias laborum in St. Petersburg, translated by de eerste arbeide, I guess they must have there must have been a confusion with primitivas, eerste, first, because it's closer, I think. No, it's first. There must have been something. No, de gifte hare arbeiden. Oh, most probably it's. No, Toronto is again closer, because in St. Petersburg, gifte hare is fallen out at some point. So although Toronto was written 150 years after St. Petersburg, it still has a more original wording of the oldest Psalter translation. Yes, so from these examples, we can deduce that the word order stays very close to the Latin, but it doesn't follow it slavishly. Nevertheless, in the past, this kind of translations were called inferior or unintelligible, but most probably we should call them successful in combining accessibility to the Latin text with making sound sentences according to the Dutch grammar. In this respect, they were the first step away from strictly interlinear versions of Latin texts, where there was no relation between the vernacular words, so no horizontal relation, but only between the vernacular word and the Latin word. So there was a strictly vertical relation. The aforementioned Wachtendonck Psalter must have looked like that. If we then take a look at the manuscripts, the individual manuscripts of this oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation from another perspective, we notice that the initial intention, helping the reader in his or more likely her understanding of the Latin text, is in some cases even augmented, again in different ways. In the St. Petersburg manuscript, for instance, this becomes clear from the fact that the Latin opening of each verse is mentioned in the margin, as you can see on the slide. It is not uncommon in Middle Dutch Psalters that each psalm starts with a rubric of the Latin incipit of the psalm, but the fact that each verse is supplied with the Latin incipit, that's quite rare. It makes it all the more clear that this Psalter specimen was to be used very close to the liturgy. In the oldest version of the Hours of the Virgin, as already mentioned, present in the same manuscript, the verses are not supplied with the Latin incipit. In these hours, more or less 1/3 of the same translated psalms occur, as in the full Psalter, and there, mostly, but not always, only the indication psalm opens the psalm translation. In this case, if you take a look, then you can see it here. It's the abbreviation of psalm is written here. But further, there's no clear reference to the Latin originals. Nevertheless, in an accepted but still to be published article, I conclude that the translation of the Hours of the Virgin must have been used in the proximity of the Latin prayer as well. Some translations of especially small texts, such as antiphons and collects, are very hard to understand without the Latin original next to them. A manuscript for more or less the same period, but made in Brabant this time, with that Psalter translation, already has the translation already transmitted into the Brabant dialect. This one has other features to make clear that this witness was to be used close to the Latin liturgy. The text itself is almost the same as the one in the St. Petersburg manuscript, and there, not every verse is accompanied by the Latin incipit, but only the opening of each translated psalm, so in the rubric. However, at the beginning of the manuscript, we find guidelines in Middle Dutch which psalms should be read at each of the canonical hours according to the secular cycle, so not the monastic. The guidelines do, however, not mention other periods of the year or specific feasts. The next manuscript was also made in the first half of the 14th century. In older works, it was located in Flanders because of its calendar, which was intended or is intended for Ghent, which is indeed was a part of the county of Flanders. But if we take a look at the dialect, then we find quite some linguistic forms typical for the Brabant dialect. My hypothesis is that this one was made in Brabant, but for a client in Ghent. Different from all the other manuscripts of the Flemish Psalter version, this one has the Latin text and the Middle Dutch text next to each other. The Latin text was without any doubt the most important one, as the Dutch text has quite some mistakes in it. Moreover, the Dutch text was adapted, so each Latin verse and each vernacular verse could start on the same line. And you can check it out on the slide. Every verse from the Latin and the Middle Dutch start on the same line. As a Dutch translation of a Latin text normally has more words than the original, this is not that obvious. This could only be obtained by adapting the Dutch translation, sometimes quite severely. For instance, superfluous words were left out and the wording where possible was shortened, as becomes clear in these verses from Psalm 77 again. So here, Eduxit aquam de Petra is translated uit het water van den Stine. He leadde uit het water van den Stine. In the other manuscript, shorter, he leadde water van den Stine. Leedde uit die water als een vloed. Deduxit tam quam flumini aquas is shorter, and leedde ze als een vloedswater. So is using the genitive here. The same for verse 25. Dat brood der engelen. The pronomen is left out, so we get brood der engelen. And it's not heeft eaten, has eaten, but ate. So shortened again. And we notice that for the full text of the Psalter, they shortened it as much as possible. So every time each verse could be on the same line. In any case, this again shows the prominence of the Latin text and most probably the use of this book in the proximity of the liturgy. The same goes undoubtedly for the two newly found folios of a late 13th century Latin Psalter provided with an interlinear version in Middle Dutch. So I already have shown this. The two folios nowadays build the cover of a collection of statutes from the 17th century, coming from a small village in the eastern part of the province of Limburg, almost on the present border with Germany, so completely to the east. The collection is now kept in a city archive. As is quite clear, the cover built by the two folios is much older than the collection of statutes. The decoration is more specifically typical for Latin Psalters made in the second half of the 13th century, as was confirmed to me by a French art historian who was specialized in secondary decoration in Gothic manuscripts. So she gave me a couple of examples of Latin Psalters that were decorated in the same manner, the same style, and they all date from the second half of the 13th century. So this is another one, and this one also belongs to the same tradition. Surprisingly enough, these Latin Psalters were not made in the eastern part of nowadays Flanders, where the folios were found, but in the western part, more specifically in the county of Flanders. From about 1240 up until the 1270s, Bruges was indeed the center of Flemish Psalter illustration. The tradition spread to the city of Ghent, in which it lived on up until the beginning of the 14th century. In Ghent, especially Psalters of a lower quality were made. The textualis, of the Latin text indeed points towards the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. So that's why at this point, I believe that it might be a Psalter decorated in Ghent. The textualis of the Middle Dutch text, on the other hand, seems quite a bit younger and, if I am correct, needs to be dated at the end of the 14th century, even around 1400. The dialect of the translation can safely be described as Flemish, meaning the Middle Dutch dialect spoken in the medieval county of Flanders, indeed the region in which the Latin Psalter was made. So everything points towards this region, although nowadays the two folios are somewhere here, so next to, almost on the border with Germany. In other words, the context in which the Latin Psalter was made and the Middle Dutch translation was added has most probably nothing to do with the context in which the two remaining folios eventually ended up. At this point, it is, however, unclear how and when the two folios were turned into a cover for a collection of statutes at the other end of the Dutch-speaking region. For the analysis of the folios themselves, it is safe to state that we do not need to take into account the Eastern context in which they were found. The two folios are decorated in the style of the 13th century Bruges Ghent Flemish tradition, I would call it, which was only used for psalters, and the folios must therefore come from a full psalter and, for instance, not from another liturgical or from a paraliturgical book, such as a breviary or a book of hours. Only by the look of the Latin folios we can deduce that they were not part of a prayer book, and the surviving psalms confirm this. The two folios hold the Latin and Middle Dutch texts of Psalms 11 verse 3 up to Psalm 13 verse 3 again, and then the second folio, on the second folio we find Psalm 19 verse 6 up into Psalm 21 verse 2. In other words, only of two full psalms, Psalm 12 and Psalm 20. These psalms are not part of a certain cycle of psalms, such as the penitential psalms, and this series, this cycle, can often be found in, for instance, prayer books or other books of devotion. In other words, the folios must indeed be the surviving folios of a full Latin Psalter that was most probably provided with a full interlinear translation in Dutch. In this perspective, the find is indeed remarkable. Glosses and interlinear versions of the Psalms are mostly seen as typical for the early Middle Ages, as was already clear from my short discussion of the Old Dutch Wachtendonck Psalter, written around 900. For the rich German tradition of Psalter translations, the study by Schoendorff, published in 1967, only mentions one full interlinear Psalter version made after the 12th century. It was written around 1500 in the Cistercian community of Medingen. The interlinear version is in Middle Low German. For the Middle Dutch tradition, this is the first known witness of this kind of use for Psalter translations. In fact, it's even different from the Psalter in Medingen, as that one has a strictly one-on-one translation. Above each Latin word is the German alternative, as you can see in the focus. Just as was the case in early medieval, or was a tradition in early medieval interlinear Psalter translations. The vernacular words relate to the Latin words they are written above, and so there's a vertical relation. We can assume that that was the case for the lost Wachtendonck Psalter as well. The Middle Dutch translation on the two discovered folios, on the other hand, is not a one-on-one translation like the one from Medingen. The translation is written between the lines, not entirely in a random manner with regard to the Latin text, but certainly not without a strictly vertical relation, or not with but certainly not with a strictly vertical relation. So, for instance, here you see Gloria, the Latin word Gloria, translated by glory, that's the same. But then here you have est, which is this word es, and above est we find sine, which means his. So here we have gloriam then. This word is even not translated into Middle Dutch, but the Latin gloriam is here. So there's no a vertical relation, or not a strictly vertical relation. Moreover, different from the Medingen Psalter, this was not an integrated project. Many decades after the Latin Psalter was made, an existing Middle Dutch translation was added. In this case, it was the oldest translation was inserted between the Latin lines. All of this makes this find, although in any case, in my eyes, all the more remarkable. As already mentioned, for the tradition of the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation, we had 4 witnesses dating from the first half of the 14th century and one that is made in 1480. We will discuss that one extensively in a couple of minutes. The interlinear translation on the 2 newly found folios dates, in my opinion, from the second half, even from the last quarter of the 14th century. Here, we seem to have an additional, slightly evolved witness of the Flemish Psalter translation, and different from other witnesses, one that is not affected by a conversion to the Brabant dialect. That was indeed the first step in the further evolution of the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation, the adaptation to the dialect of the new region to which the Western translation was distributed. In Brabant, the Flemish translation was then subject to further alterations and evolutions, and was then spread further to the east, not only of the Low Countries, but to the German-speaking region as well. Traces of an already evolved version can, for instance, be noticed in the Psalter of the so-called Kölner Bible. So here you see my scheme I once made. I was too lazy to translate it fully into English, but I just wrote some English words next to it, so it would remain understandable for everyone. So around 1300 was my guess at the time. We have the original Flemish translation. It was spread to Brabant in the next decades, where it was adapted. And from Brabant, it was spread to the German area, where it influenced some German, in this case, Lower and Middle German Bible versions and Psalter versions. So, for instance, its influences can be noticed in the Psalter of the so-called Kölner Bible, a Low German Bible version printed in 1478-79. Next to that, an evolved version of the oldest Psalter translation. So that's this arrow, that's this direction, must have been picked up by the modern devotion. I distinguished 2 different adaptations of the evolved version within that movement, one in the eastern region of Rhine and Meuse, and the second one, probably somewhat younger one, in the northwestern region of Utrecht and Holland. The first one, so I called it Modern Devotion 1. The first one was used by regular canonesses and always accompanies the Latin text. So this is an example of that first translation, first adaptation within the Modern Devotion. In some cases, glosses, so small remarks, were added to the translation, and the text stays very close to the Latin original. It was clearly meant for users who prayed the Divinum Officium and needed a translation to better understand and acquire more insight into these liturgical texts. It can only be found now in a handful of manuscripts. The second one was in the western region of the more western region of Utrecht and Holland, and it was used there by Franciscan tertiaries, women who did not pray the Divinum Officium. This heavily adapted descendant of the oldest Middle Dutch translation did not follow the Latin text as strictly as the first translation that originated within the modern devotion. This one was exactly that very popular version, the most popular version of the Middle Dutch Psalter made. So here you have an example of such a manuscript. Perhaps even up to 80 manuscripts with that translation are still extant, as there were indeed also more than 100 communities of Franciscan tertiaries in the northern part of the Low Countries, especially in the 15th century. It was even so popular that we notice influences on later 15th century psalters written in the southern part of the Low Countries. So originally the translation was made here in the west, spread to the east, adapted again, and then spread to the north. And then from the north, influences came back to the traditions that were present at that time in the south. These were then really quite hybrid translations, with the base still formed by the oldest Psalter translation, but along the way influenced by the Psalter translation, by the Herne, as you can see here. So we are talking about this now. These are these hybrid, very hybrid translations. So they were influenced by they started with the original Flemish translation. They were adapted also in Herne, and then eventually also influenced by the modern devotion psalters, and then you get these very hybrid psalters at the end of the 15th century. An example is this one. So these were influenced by the Psalter translation by the Herne Bible translator, and also by the second translation of the modern devotion. The translation on the two folios that are still at the center of our attention here, however, show no influence by conversion in the Brabant dialect, nor by the two later influential Psalter translations we just discussed. It is, in other words, a version of the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation in the Flemish dialect. When I received the images of the two folios, and as the Latin Psalter clearly was made in the 13th century, for a moment I thought, or perhaps hoped, that they were remains of the autograph of that oldest Psalter translation. As this translation is indeed one that stays fairly close to the Latin text, it once was suggested that it was indeed an evolved version of an interlinear translation. It would also be the logical way for vernacular translations to come into existence, literally as continuous subtitles, or perhaps in this case more correctly, supertitles to the Latin texts, so those who did not understand the language of the liturgy could follow anyway. We cannot rule out the possibility that vernacular translations such as this one indeed came into being as part of a Latin Psalter, but these two folios do not prove that. At this point, I believe that they do not contain the original text of the Flemish translation of the Psalter, but already an evolved version. It even contains quite some scribal mistakes. How the text here, however, exactly relates to the ones in the other manuscripts of this tradition still needs to be analyzed. Next to that, it remains at this moment unclear why the scribe of this translation has chosen not to write the words in a continuous flow, as there is no strictly vertical relation to the Latin texts, but at some points has clearly left space, so it more or less resembles a classic interlinear translation. So a classical, one-on-one translation. Nevertheless, the functionality of this interlinear translation seems completely different from, for instance, the one in Medingen, in which each Latin word was provided with the German alternative. As the German text was not intended to be read horizontally, because the word order was that of the Latin text, it must have been meant to gain more insight into the Latin text. This interlinear translation, as most of the early medieval specimens, which are of the same type, was in other words made for someone who was already on a more advanced level. The Middle Dutch interlinear translation on the two folios, on the other hand, was clearly meant for someone who had little or no understanding of the Latin words, but needed a full translation of the text to be able to more or less grasp the content of the psalm. By whom it was commissioned is, at least at this moment, however, impossible to tell. Again, the vernacular text here relates to the Latin text in a different way. In the first two manuscripts we discussed, the Latin psalm was not written down entirely in the manuscript itself and was limited to the incipit of the psalm or the incipit of each verse. Nevertheless, we can assume that the Latin was present in another way, presumably while it was read or sung aloud in the liturgical service, or because the user of the manuscript knew the Latin text by heart, but needed or wanted the vernacular for extra support, extra understanding, or perhaps even study. In the two last specimens we discussed, the Latin text is present on the page and is clearly the most important of the two versions. This becomes clear in the Psalter with the two versions next to each other, as the Middle Dutch version was adapted and by doing so became less understandable, so all verses of both the Latin original and the translation would start on the same line. In the two newly found folios, finally, the relation between the two is already obvious at eyesight. What has already become clear is that vernacular Psalter versions were extremely flexible in their wording and in their use. This is, of course, a well-known characteristic of medieval writings, especially of non-canonical texts, and this Psalter translation proves it in particular. It becomes even more obvious if we take a look at the two remaining manuscripts that hold the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation. Presumably belonging to the second quarter of the 14th century is a very small convolute. And here you can see it is very small. These are my fingers, and I have very small hands, containing, amongst others, a Middle Dutch translation of the Psalms. The text of the translation is in general fairly equal to the one in the St. Petersburg manuscript, but seems nevertheless already evolved within the Brabant region, and perhaps even influenced by the presumed Psalter translation by the Herne Bible translator. It is this evolved version that seems to have been distributed to the German-speaking region. In this small manuscript, clearly a book that was suited to carry in one's pockets, the Psalms are mostly preceded again by their Latin incipit, as you can see on the slide, but otherwise there is no obvious relation to the liturgy. Although in its form there might be not much difference with the other Psalter we discussed that had Latin incipits at the beginning of each psalm, but for instance did have a list of psalms with their use in the liturgy, this one, such a feature, such a list for instance, fails in this small manuscript. Moreover, at least one psalm is preceded by a somewhat strange rubric, in any case, not a rubric I found in other Middle Dutch Psalters, and certainly not within the tradition of the oldest translation. Preceding the translation of Psalm 42 is a rubric that states, and I read it in Dutch, Die wandelen wilt daar hij hem ontziet, hij lezen diesen psalm, judica me Deus et discerne causam. So in English, he who wants to go where he has feared to go must read this psalm, judica me Deus et discerne causam. So if this can be considered as a piece of evidence, which I should analyze more in detail, we could conclude that the Psalms in this manuscript seem to have been noted down for their value as private prayers and for their power. At the end of the 15th century or the beginning of the 16th century, the manuscript most probably belonged to a Beguine. If the initial client for whom the book was made belonged to the same population group, that is quite uncertain. It would, however, confirm the hypothesis that it was not used as a means to better understand the liturgy, Beguines in the Low Countries are not known to have been praying the Divinum Officium. The last and youngest textual witness is quite an exception in several respects. First of all, it dates from the end of the 15th century, around 150 years after the manuscript now in St. Petersburg was made, the oldest textual witness. Next, its abundant decoration contrasts sharply to the fairly modest way in which the other specimens of this translation were made. It can even be considered as the most luxurious Middle Dutch Psalter of all, period. Finally, we do not know who exactly were the first users or owners of the other textual witnesses, but we might assume, certainly for the first four we discussed, that these were used by people, women most probably, who led an institutionalized religious life, as they had to pray the Divinum Officium. For the fifth one, because of the other texts that are part of this convolute, all prayers and texts of devotion, sometimes of a mystical nature, we also have to think of at least someone who led a religious life, but perhaps not in a convent. This last, late witness, however, was made for a noblewoman who lived in Ghent. We know quite a fair deal about this lady, as the manuscript holds an extensive colophon. From the added miniature, we can even deduce how she must have looked like, more or less, of course. So this is the owner. The woman is the owner, was the original owner of the manuscript. Her name was Antonine van Massemen. She was widow of a knight called Martin Villain, and you see him pictured also on the miniature, although by the time he was pictured here, he died already 25 years earlier. So he died in 1466, and the manuscript was made in 1480. In the colophon is mentioned which villages, hamlets, and manors Antonine van Massemen and her family owned. Especially her late husband belonged to one of the oldest Flemish aristocratic dynasties, a family that was especially powerful in the Ghent region. Shortly, however, after Antonine came into the possession of her own manor, many slumbering conflicts in Ghent and its wider region broke out, a period we know as the Revolt of Ghent. It lasted from 1449 up to 1453. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, wanted, however, to show who was really in control, and a number of battles took place in the wider Ghent region. A part of Antonine's own manor was destroyed in this period, and the larger part of her husband's possessions were confiscated. After the revolt, he tried to get those possessions back, but deeply ran into debt by doing so. A couple of years after he got back from a trip to the Holy Land, Martin Villain died in 1466. After his death, Antonine would live for another 30 years. These weren't necessarily the easiest years of her life. A couple of years after she became a widow, she was abducted by a nobleman, so kidnapped, but the new Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, who was in Ghent at the time, did everything he could to bring Antonine back. Around 10 years after this adventure, she ordered the Psalter that is at the center of our attention now. It was in a period when things went well again, especially for the only child she had with Martin. He was called Adrian. In 1477, he became the counselor and chamberlain of the new Duke of Burgundy, Maximilian of Austria. And in 1479, he became an alderman in Ghent. So he had power within the Burgundian Empire, and he had also power in the city. However, in 1490, he would become a victim of the conflicts that had risen between Maximilian and the Flemish cities, and was killed 3 months before his wife, to whom he was on his way at that time, would give birth to their son. As we know from other cases in the Low Countries, women sometimes received a luxurious psalter in the vernacular when they chose for a religious life and entered a convent. This was, however, not the case for Antonine, as is clear from the opening folio of the manuscript, showing her and her late husband kneeling in front of a I was a bit distracted here. Kneeling in front of a crucifixion, of an altarpiece showing Christ carrying the cross, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Christ. This psalter has moreover several other aspects which make it obvious that there is little or no connection to the liturgy. The Psalms are arranged in their biblical order and have the Latin incipit as a rubric. Liturgical references lack, however. In the beginning of the manuscript, we find the Psalms listed from 1 up to 150 with only their Latin incipits next to them. This wasn't, however, of much use in a liturgical context, we may assume. Reminding of the liturgy are the places where we find 4 more miniatures. From the early Middle Ages onwards, the Psalter was often divided into 8 parts according to the Divinum Officium. Later on, miniatures were put at the beginning of those 8 parts, so at the beginning of the Psalms for Matins on Sunday, for Matins on Monday, etc. Before the first Psalm for Vesper, an 8th miniature was inserted. The Psalter of Antonine lacks, in other words, 4 miniatures to be really useful for the liturgical prayer. The miniatures merely had a decorative function, I presume. The fact that Antonine had a Middle Dutch Psalter as a book of devotion is remarkable for several reasons. First of all, from the southern part of the Low Countries, we have less than a handful of psalters written in Middle Dutch. From the northern part, thanks to the Devotio Moderna, we have at least 60, but presumably 80 or more. Moreover, noble women mostly ordered books of hours, not psalters. And finally, the nobility, and especially Flanders, was mainly Francophone, so the choice for a Middle Dutch book was peculiar. Even Latin books of devotion were chosen over Middle Dutch ones. So Antonine's choice for a Middle Dutch Psalter surprises, especially because the text is practically the same as in the manuscript now in St. Petersburg, a book that was around 150 years older, with words that were already archaic and out of use by the beginning of the 15th century. As it seems, someone found a very old specimen of the oldest Middle Dutch Psalter translation, presumably in one of the religious houses in Ghent, and just copied it or had it copied without any adaptation. We could therefore assume that the text was not really intended to be read and used in Antonine's private prayer, but that the manuscript merely was a luxurious book with a devotional content, functioning primarily as a richly decorated container for the portrait of her and her late husband, remembering the times when they were still together. The fact that the folios are still almost immaculately white, as you can see here, could confirm this. For us, however, it is, next to a curious cultural historical object, also a well-preserved witness of the oldest Psalter translation in Dutch. Thank you.
Youri, thank you very, very much. Thank you for this informative, illuminating, and inspiring talk about Dutch translations. Thank you for showing us the beautiful manuscripts so that we could see for ourselves the scribal hands, the abbreviations, the decorations. I think we all loved them. We just love both the Psalms and their material manifestations. Thank you also for showing us your personal perspective of, I loved how you said, how you did justice to the medieval translations by saying that they were previously criticized for being too Slavish, and you saw the purpose to them and you brought it to the fore. And I really liked that because this is all too easy to say they didn't know how to translate. Now we know much better, but we still very often come across those critical assessments of medieval translations. So thank you for that as well. And thank you also for showing us, as much as that was possible, the people behind the Psalms and Psalters and the translators and the users and all of this. On the whole, my impression is that it seems that the Dutch translations of the Psalms, the tradition of the Dutch translations of the Psalms is very rich, both in terms of many coexisting versions and many extant manuscripts of all of these versions. So thank you very, very much for all of this. I have hundreds of questions, but I suppose as a host of this meeting, I should open the floor to discussion. And so I invite all of you to ask your questions, either signal your willingness to ask the question by clicking on the icon of the raised hand, or by typing the text of your question in the chat box. Whichever way you prefer, the floor is yours. But thank you, Youri. That was just splendid.
Thank you, Magda.
That was desplendid. So we're waiting for questions. And if there are not, oh yes, there is. Okay, Małgorzata Dowłaszewicz, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Hi, Youri. Thank you very much for this really great presentation. I know your work, previous work, and I know some information you mentioned, and I'm waiting for what you do more, especially with those two parts. And I have two questions, actually. One is rather general, because you were talking about the Herne Bible translator, so the translator of 1360. And I was just wondering, because some years ago already, Michael Kors and Geert Claessens have actually set a name upon this translator, and they say it's Petrus Nachel. So my question is, why aren't you using that name? Are you not sure he is the translator of the Herne Bible? Do you have doubts? And of course, you mentioned sometimes like you're very concerned about not to say too much as far as you're not sure. So that's my first question. That's a very short one. And the second, I found it very interesting that first Brussels manuscript, that's 2518, that there was this shortened version of the translator. And of course, it was a pragmatic choice of the translator to do that. But I was wondering if it was picked up later. Do you have any evidence that this shortened version was used later as well? Was it something that was also has a tradition in Nachleben, or was that only in this one manuscript?
Okay, thank you, Gosha, for your questions. The first one, indeed, I'm not the only one doubting about the identity of the Herne Bible translator. So quite a lot of colleagues in Middle Dutch research or in Middle Dutch scholarship are doubting this name, Petrus Nachel. So I know Geert is still using that name. But as most of us do not use it and are fairly critical about that identification, because it's also, as I recently read, a proposal for a project by Mike Kestemont and at the University of Antwerp. They I didn't know, but they seem to have a project on the Herne manuscript, and you can read the proposal. It was published in Queste also, and they specifically say the work in Herne was actually a collective work, so we shouldn't be too quick or even too eager to know the name of this Bible translator, because in fact it doesn't matter. It was a collective work. So it's a bit wrong to pick this one person from the convent and name him and forget about all the rest, because that was really what they are trying to do with the new project, is by studying all the manuscripts from Herne, showing that it really was a collective work at the convent, and so that's one reason more for me not to mention his name. And indeed, I don't know if you noticed, but I in a couple of sentences I talked about not Herne, the Herne Bible translator, but Herne chose and the Charterhouse did So I tend to follow this idea that it was a collective piece of work. And then your second question was about the shortened version in manuscript 2518. No, there's no evidence that this was really followed by others. So that is what I also wanted to stress in my talk, that really from one copy to another, things could change very rapidly and be followed or not be followed. So it's a very flexible translation piece of text. So we should. So I talked about De Bruyn also. He identified three major Psalter translations, but in fact that's way too simple. It's way more complex than that, and I think he knew it, but I think he also had he didn't have the courage or the energy or the time or the lust to study it in detail. So, but it's very complex and with a lot of influences. So no, they didn't follow that one example. No. As far as I know.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and I'm looking forward to your future publications on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As I see no questions right now, I wonder if I can ask a question without clicking on the raised hand icon. I hope I can. I can grant myself that privilege as a host. Actually, I have three questions. One is very short, one is slightly longer, and the third one is probably the longest. So I'll start in that order. You mentioned a book of hours, which was written in 2 dialects. And I wonder what the functionality of that combination would be. I assume the dialects were mutually intelligible, and that is obviously, but the particular choice in the context of the intended addressee is the thing that really attracted my attention. And the other thing the other question concerns the same manuscript 2518, the Brussels manuscript. You were talking about the shortened text, and you said they shortened the text to match the Latin text so that they all start in the same place. And I wonder, because this seems like a very kind of barbarian approach to the text, because they could have used the smaller hand, right? And they could have fit the text in as well. There must have been a reason why they didn't do it, because obviously there is this purely graphical aspect, and they were completely successful in that. But I think that tells us also something about the intended addressee. If I may, the third question. Where is my third? It's about the books of hours. As you know, I'm a fan of books of hours. And given the multitude of Dutch translations and of the surviving manuscripts, each of them would be slightly different. Was there a particular tradition that would tend to be preferred in books of hours? A particular tradition of translation? And were all translations coming from the same tradition, or would there be a mixture? And if the Psalms repeated, as we know they did within books of hours, would they always be the same? I'm so sorry, but I waited so long for your talk. I just can't stop myself.
Okay, no problem. First question.
The 2 dialects.
2 dialects, yes. That's actually in the St. Petersburg manuscript, so it's not really a book of hours. It's really a very rich manuscript. It has the full Psalter translation. It has the Hours of the Virgin also, but it also has the oldest Middle Dutch translation of the Apocalypse. It has mystical texts in it. It's really a very rich manuscript. And it will be at the center of my attention in the project I am writing at the moment. The project proposal I'm writing, not the project, the project proposal. So my idea was that the Psalter, the full Psalter is in Flemish, but the same psalms, or some of the psalms occur in the Hours of the Virgin, and there they are in a different dialect, in the Brabant dialect. So my idea is the manuscript must have been written in Brabant. They imported a full Psalter translation from the West They just copied it because it was way too much, I think, to translate it into Brabant at that time. They didn't see the point. But then perhaps in a later stage, they picked the Psalms necessary for their Book of Hours. And then while making a new Book of Hours, they converted it into their own dialect. So it's not really, I think it's just a matter of time, chronology, and yeah, I think the choice to when they made their own text from the Psalms, namely in the Book of Hours, they had the time and the will to convert it into their own dialect.
But it also shows that the Book of Hours is kind of closer to the heart because they gave it in their own dialect.
Could be a reason, yes. But my hypothesis on that is now in somewhere between it's in the with the editors of a journal. So
okay, so I'm looking forward to that very much.
Then your second question was on the 25
shortened text.
Yeah,
why not smaller? Text. Why not smaller letters?
I think that's pure aesthetics. It would not be. They didn't like that. I think they wouldn't like it, and it would be very difficult because every verse is not. Verses are not the same length. Mm-hmm. So every time you would have a different.
Yeah, okay, I get it.
So
yes.
the letters would with every verse, the letters would be smaller or bigger.
Right, that makes sense. So that was purely functional. So yes. Like the Paris Psalter with King Alfred's, they tried to fit the Old English around Latin, and then there was some illustrations, some sketches put in, and then there was just much more Old English text and much less Latin text, and that's what they did. But then it didn't really look very. I mean, I love it, but probably by their standards, it wasn't what they wanted to get, a fully covered page.
And if you remember the page, I can show you again. But if you remember the page, it also had some marginal decoration, for instance, of a dog chasing a rabbit. So it really was also something for the eye.
Yes.
It was important aesthetics for this one.
Makes perfect sense.
And then your last was on the translations of the Books of Hours.
The choice of Psalms in the Books of Hours.
Yeah. So the most spread version is the version by Geert Grote. I don't know if you know the name. Geert Grote was the founder of the instigator of the modern devotion. So the reform movement I talked about. And it is said that he translated or he made his own Middle Dutch translation of the Book of Hours. And that was at the end of he died in 1384 and he made it just before he died. So at the end of the 14th century, he made, is what people say, is what the tradition says. He made his own Middle Dutch version of a Book of Hours.
And he did not rely on any of the existing Psalter translations in that?
Well, that's my hypothesis in my latest article that is not yet published. There I talk about an older version of the Book of Hours, and we know from other writings that Geert Grote wanted a new Middle Dutch version of the Book of Hours because he disliked the older one, but we don't know exactly which one the older one was. Mm-hmm. And in my article, I state that the Middle Dutch version I, so the oldest one I discuss, could very well be the one he disliked, but we do not know for certain. If you compare them to each other, there is overlap, but there are much differences as well. So it's very difficult to say if he really knew that one, if he really used that one. And then in the context of the modern devotion, I talked about this Psalter as well. I called it Modern Devotion 2. the Modern Devotion 2 version of the Psalter, actually contains all the psalms that we also find in the Book of Hours by Geert Grote. So the normally we think that Geert Grote translated his Book of Hours, and then later on his psalm translations were took out of his Book of Hours and were translated to or were completed to a full Psalter translation. And that one is then Modern Devotion 2. Could you follow a little bit? And that one is really the most well spread. And his Book of Hours is still available in 800 up to 2000 specimens. So it's really very extant still. Yes.
You mean so many manuscripts?
Yeah. Yeah.
I've read that somewhere, but I thought that must have been a mistake.
No, in that very translation of Geert Grote, so of the Modern Devotion, there are still 800 to 2000 extant copies. They still haven't been studied very well, but Anna Dlabachova now just started a new an ERC project which has exactly that Book of Hours translation as its subject.
Oh, because there are 17 extant books of hours in English, and I'm so excited at being able to compare so many. Of the shadow over my project immediately.
No. You should be happy because it's really possible then to study them all. 800 to 2000 is yes, it's impossible to.
How can you have a discrepancy between 800 and 2000?
Because still a lot of copies. We still have, let's say, every day, every year, new copies appear from libraries, from private people, etc., etc. So
great.
It's an estimation, yes.
Yeah, thank you. We have a question from Kinga Rees. Kinga, go ahead.
Yes. So first of all, thank you for this very interesting speech. I'm much impressed, and I wanted to say that it really shed some light on what I'm actually doing right now. And I'm very much interested in this Psalter that was actually asked, that two of the previous speakers asked about. So the one where you said that some superfluous words were actually cut out. And I'm wondering, so you said that they are superfluous, so there were like demonstratives or articles or some elements of the verbal phrase that were actually deleted. But so the text is still understandable, it's simply shorter.
Yeah, it's still understandable, but it's not that nice anymore, and you need a little bit more, let's say, effort to really understand it. So in some places, if you do not understand anything of Latin, then it becomes really difficult to understand the Middle Dutch phrasing. Okay,
thank you. Because I have this Anglo-Norman text in which what they do is actually, instead of cutting off portions of the text, they would actually insert them into any empty space they have on the page, wherever that might be. So it could be next to like some remaining space in a Latin verse or whatever, which makes for a very difficult reading, but still they do preserve the text. So this is very interesting. And one more thing, if I can, I'm wondering about what you said about the earlier texts being also always closer to the Latin. Because like in English tradition, it's not necessarily the case at all times. And I'm wondering, so it's also not like a rule in the Dutch tradition.
No, it's not a rule. What I actually, I think I formulated not accurately enough. If you find Latin words in the Middle Dutch translation, that could be a sign that it is older. And for instance, you had there, if you remember, in Campo Tanios, Campo was just taken over from the Latin, And then in the St. Petersburg manuscript, we already read a translation in Dutch, namely field, veld. So that is what I mean. But it doesn't mean exactly that when a text, when the translation is more accurate to the Latin, then that is not a sign that it is older. So I think we must not confuse between
okay.
those
Okay,
two.
so thank you very much for the clarification. Okay. Well, actually, this is also what happens, I guess, in English translations, that in the earlier translations, you do get quite a lot of words which do resemble Latin words or let's say French words formally, and later on do they like become replaced?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I can see no further questions, and also we've just reached, well, the provisional limit of our meeting. Some people texted me individually, I don't know why not in the main chat, but saying, thank you very much, Youri, this was impressive. So I'm relaying that to you from my private chat.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. It's now the time to give you the big hand, and I think applause is in order. And I invite all of you and more for our next meeting. We're still staying within the Low Countries. During our next meeting, I'm sorry, that's not exactly it. We're going to listen to Thijs Polk from Leiden University, who's going to talk about writing between the lines towards a typology of glossing techniques in the Old English glossed psalters. So please remember, you can join us for that. We also send you the reminder so that you do not have to look through the mailbox, and you can join us. If you feel like inviting any other people, please do. Everybody is welcome here. And for today, thank you very, very much, and have a lovely evening. And Youri, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
Grant.
Bye-bye.